Bars Can't Hold Us by Laura of Matoria. Chapter 5. The Malcordans had taken Keith half an hour ago. Lance was trying not to think about it. They would bring him back. They had to. They'd brought back Hunk and Lance, after all. Apparently, Lance hadn't even been gone that long, though he couldn't remember it himself. They must have kept the machine going until he slipped completely into unconsciousness, since the last thing he remembered was overwhelming pain in his head, his whole body, and the sense that Blue was screaming with him. He shuddered and curled up tighter into Hunk's body, working the tool into the cuff with more determination than ever. Hunk's wrists were still fastened to the floor, and eventually even sitting grew to be too tiring, so he had laid himself on the floor with his bound wrists in front of his face. Lance lay down next to him, rolled into a ball with his head pressing against Hunk's chest and his knees drawn up between the press of their two bodies. Every muscle in Lance's body still felt cramped and overworked from the electricity that had passed through them, and the only thing that brought relief was curling into the fetal position like this. At least his noses stopped bleeding. "Tell me about what you're gonna make for us to eat when we get out of here, Hunkalicious," Lance said. He needed the sound of Hunk's voice, and Hunk needed the distraction. They also needed to cover up the sound of Lance trying to force what was basically a prison shiv into a highly advanced, highly complex piece of technology attached to his wrist. Hunk hummed. "We still have some of those Danbarian baking mixes back at the Castle Lions. I was thinking maybe I would try for a cake again. I know the last try wasn't great, ended up way too dense and hard. It was more like a scone than a cake." "It was still delicious," Lance said absently. "Everything you make is delicious." "I appreciate that, sweetheart, but you know it's not true." "It is," Lance insisted. "But tell me about the cake." "Okay, well, I'm thinking that maybe the problem was the eggs. The Danbarian flour is a lot heavier than wheat flour on Earth, so that is why it didn't react the way we usually expect. And I can't raise the proportion of baking soda and acid anymore, or it will start affecting the flavor. But I can do the eggs differently, right? I'll beat the yolks in with the fat and sweetener, go for ribbon stage, and whip the whites separately. Eggs are fundamentally the same across most species on Earth, so space eggs are probably similar. Same protein structures in the whites, should be. So you whip that up with some salt and a little hint of acid, and the protein structures break apart and gradually reform, stretch along different lines, right? And that's how you get meringue." "You're gonna put meringue in a cake?" Lance was only barely following, focused so intently on the cuff on his wrist, hidden between his chest and Hunk's. His left wrist was resting on the floor, right hand holding their precious tool as he worked by feel, trying to find an opening. Before Keith was taken, they had both taken turns rubbing the little metal strip on the floor, working one end as thin as they could get it. Now it was razor sharp and almost paper thin for a good inch or so. If anything would fit between the edge of the indicator light and the rest of the cuff, this should be it. At least this was the only thing they were going to get their hands on that might do it. But he couldn't make it fit. He'd been trying since they took Keith, and he couldn't get it in. He'd been slowly working his way around the cuff, trying every fraction of an inch on both sides of the light strip. He was hoping for one place, just one, where there might be the smallest bit of a gap. No luck so far, but Lance wasn't giving up until he tried every single possibility. And then, if nothing worked, he was going to start over from the beginning to double check. And then he would do it again. Hunk chuckled, warm and low in his chest. He drew up his own legs, curving around Lance's fetal ball as much as he could. Lance hummed in appreciation, glad for the added warmth. The floor was cold, and the only heat they had was each other. "Not a meringue, silly," Hunk said gently. "I'll whip the eggs to stiff peaks, but not for meringue. That's just a stage. Then I'll fold it into the batter, right? Slow, gentle movements. Turn the bowl a quarter turn after each fold. Bring the batter up from the bottom and fold it gently in. Keep as much air as possible in the mixture. So when I'm done, it'll be all light and fluffy and sweet. And then I'll bake it, see what happens. Might rise up like a souffle. Might make a decent sponge cake. Might collapse right away like a house of cards. But it'll be worth a try. If anyone can make a cake out of weird alien space ingredients, it's my main man, Hunky Dory," Lance said loyally. "What flavor will you go for first?" Have to get a good basic recipe before I try to doll it up at all. So with the yolks included, it'll be a plain yellow cake. Hunk sighed. I wish I could get some butter for it, but we ran out of that a while back. They must have some kind of butter here on Malcord, Lance said. There was that dessert we had last night. It tasted kind of buttery, didn't it? Though not like cow butter. Something else. Yeah, I think you're right, Hunk said thoughtfully. Well, even if the Malcord dairy isn't quite like cow, if I can get a stock of their butter, I can try making it into ghee. You know, brown off the solids, leave us with just the clarified butter. It's easy to do, and it would strain out most of the differences between space dairy and earth dairy, lactose and casein and all that stuff. Ghee is just a fat, so if it comes from any kind of dairy, space ghee should be pretty similar to earth ghee. Right, so when you were talking about mixing the fat and sweetener, creaming, right. Usually when you're making a cake, you want to cream together the butter and the sugar. The fat coats the sugar and keeps the grains separate, which makes for a fluffier, lighter product. Works with cookies too. Then you add the eggs and any flavoring, on Earth usually vanilla extract, and you mix the dry ingredients separately and add them alternatively with the liquid to make a batter. Is the sweetener you have anything like cane sugar back home? Will that affect the cake? It's pretty close. Back on that tropical planet, you remember the fruits that reminded us of coconuts, but sweeter? I've been able to refine a kind of palm sugar from that stuff. Lance's mouth was watering. Abuelita made the best hot chocolate with palm sugar back home. Hunk's voice was fond. Do you mean the brand of chocolate or your actual grandma? Both! Lance had meant this topic to distract Hunk, but now he was the one getting distracted. He shook his head and focused on the cup again. Okay, back to the subject. Fruit science. Talk dirty to me, incredible Hunk. Hunk tucked his face down against Lance's hair so Lance could feel his smile, and he did. He meandered from subject to subject, comparing all kinds of ingredients they had found in space to what he remembered from Earth. Lance didn't always understand what he was talking about, but he loved the enthusiasm in Hunk's voice. He loved how smart he was, his broad knowledge base of everything he found interesting, the way he socked facts away in his big engineering brain, the way Lance accumulated trinkets in his room. He loved the way Hunk loved to cook. It wasn't just because Hunk liked to eat, because he derived pleasure and comfort from the consumption of delicious foodstuffs, but also because he loved sharing with his friends, his family, even strangers they met along the way. Food to Hunk wasn't just about survival, getting by from day to day, or even about finding something good in the train wreck their lives had become. It was also about making connections, bringing people together, and sharing as much happiness and joy as they could get away with. The Malcordans couldn't take that away. No one could. Fierce pride lit up Lance's chest, despite the ache in his head, his wrists, his entire body. The Malcordans could beat them and cut them and electrocute them and chain them to the floor, but they couldn't break them. Not him, not Hunk, not Keith. They were going to make it through this. They were going to be fine. Something clicked. Lance went still, frozen against Hunk with his head down. He'd found something, a gap in the cuff. Hunk! He murmured. He switched to Ooby Dooby, which they were both fluent in. Don't stop talking, but I think I found something. Hunk kept talking away about food, but he put a keep going in there. So Lance dug in. He had no idea what he was doing. This would be so much better if Hunk's hands were free so he could do this. He would be able to figure it out. Lance was flying blind. He couldn't slide the tool back and forth at all. It was stuck way down in a gap on the edge of the light strip, deeply lodged into the cuff. It was in the most awkward spot possible, too, on the outside edge of Lance's wrist opposite the thumb. But he'd found it. He'd found something. He couldn't move the tool back and forth in the gap, which had been his initial idea. Stick the tool into the gap, then slide it all the way around the light strip and pop it out. Not possible. But he could angle the tool instead, dinging it down into the machinery of the cuff like it was a needle, first poking a hole, then winding the hole it had made. No idea if he was accomplishing anything, but he could force movement down there. He felt the tip of the tool scraping against things in there, small bits and parts. Sometimes the resistance was greater than others. No idea what he was touching down there. Didn't feel like metal. Maybe some kind of polymer? But the cuff had to be some kind of electromagnet to work the way it did. He should find a coil of metal wire in there, something. Maybe he could knock it out of alignment, chip it away from the internal mechanism, even disconnect the power source. Lance wasn't an expert on electromagnets by any means, but he knew the basics because in their first year at Galaxy Garrison, Hunk had gone through a phase. That was the thing about Hunk. He wasn't quite a prodigy like Pidge, but he was very, very smart, and he was fascinated by a wide range of subjects. Hunk's life was basically a long series of obsessions in which he became extremely interested in something or other and spent days or even weeks researching it, packing away all the info he could find into his brain box. Then he reworked it in his head, applied it to other things, and spit it all out in new and exciting ways. And he was a talker. When he was interested in something, when he was learning and his brain was buzzing with ideas and concepts and thoughts, he had to let it out. Lance didn't know how many evenings and nights and lunch breaks and walks in the hall he had spent listening to his roommate babble on about something or other. Lance had an unfortunate habit of tuning most of it out after a while. It was too much. Lance was a good student and got high grades mostly by dint of working really, really hard, but he didn't have Hunk's obsessive personality, and he didn't share all of his interests. Hunk just had so many interests. But Lance tried to be a good friend most of the time. He made interested noises, ums and ohs and ahas, while Hunk was going on and on about something, even if he wasn't really listening. Sometimes, though, if Lance was busy or had something else he wanted to do or to talk about, he got exasperated and made disgusted more noises until Hunk stopped. The first few times, Hunk had been embarrassed and tried to apologize for being annoying, but Lance waved him off. He got that Hunk needed to talk about his latest obsession with non-Newtonian fluids or whatever, and he would totally listen. No, really, just not right this minute, okay? As they grew closer and got to know each other better, Hunk began to take Lance's moods in stride. Sometimes he kept talking even when Lance didn't want him to, which was rude, but it also made Lance happy because it meant that his sometimes shy, sometimes anxious friend was completely comfortable in his presence, enough to even ignore him when he was being a jerk. Now, Lance very rarely got tired of Hunk's babbling anymore. He found it endearing. Even when he had no idea what the guy was talking about, it was still fun to see him bright-eyed and happy. It was fun to egg him on, work him up into even greater heights of deeply nerdy weirdness. Lance loved doing that, loved being part of it, loved that Hunk trusted him with that side of himself. So, yeah, early on in their friendship, Hunk had gotten interested in electromagnets and talked about nothing else for a couple of weeks. Lance had kind of been forced to absorb at least something from it. The cuff, it had to be an electromagnet. Even a highly advanced, very compressed one, to be this small and powerful. The fact that the Malcordans could turn it on and off remotely meant that it had to have a power source housed inside the cuff, and if Lance could disconnect that would do it. No more cuff. They would still be stuck in a cold, bare cell, but they would be able to use their hands. They could fight back. They could try to rush the door the next time the guards came to take one of them away. They could get Hunk's hands off the floor so he could sit up and stretch his arms, scratch his nose without having to ask Lance to do it. That was what Lance wanted the most of all. The poor guy had to be really cramped and uncomfortable at this point, but he didn't utter one word of complaint. Lance loved him for it. He really did. But enough was enough. He kept digging, wiggling the tool around down in the cuff. It all felt a little too desperate, a little unfocused, but Lance was completely intent on this task. Hunk's voice washed over him, warm and deep and comforting, and Lance fell into a bit of a trance. It was as if he was feeling through the tool now, like it had become an extension of his finger. He brushed over the tiny parts inside the cuff, touching them one at a time, feeling out their shapes, their distances from each other, the differences in the give and pliability of each one. And there, it felt like a wire. Lance moved the tool in a swift, decisive movement, and he could have sworn he heard it snap. It was broken, and Lance knew. He was sure that he had disconnected the power source. The next time they activated his cuffs, this one wouldn't work. He knew it. "Hunk!" he murmured. "I did it!" Hunk didn't respond in words, but he smiled against Lance's hair again, and he curled up closer against his forehead. That was all the praise Lance needed. Now he just had to wait for proof. Wait for them to bring Keith back, make sure that his right cuff activated and his left one didn't. Then he would know for sure. Lance set the tool down on the floor and tried to relax against Hunk, waiting. Hunk eventually trailed off, running out of words. They lay there quietly for a few moments, cuddling on the cold floor of a prison cell. It wasn't terrible. At least they could still touch each other. Hunk blew out a slow, soft breath. Lance hummed in acknowledgement. His eyes were sliding shut. "Don't fall asleep, okay?" Hunk's voice was gentle but insistent. Lance opened his eyes wide, like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. "I won't. I'm worried about what that electricity did to you. To your brain. I think you should stay awake until we get out of here and Corinne can check you out." Lance snuggled his face into Hunk's chest and smiled. "I'm fine. It's okay. But I'll stay awake and keep you company. I know it must be hard to rest with your hands bolted to the floor." Hunk made a displeased noise and nudged him with his knee. "I'm serious. You didn't see yourself when they first brought you back. You were unconscious and we couldn't wake you up for what felt like a really, really long time. It was scary. I don't want you to pass out again." "Hunk, I promise I'm okay." Lance squirmed and stuck his head between Hunk's arms so he could smile into his face. "Everything's going to be fine. They'll bring Keith back and he's gonna be hurt, but okay. And Shiro and Paige and Garan and Alora are looking for us right now, I'm sure of it. They're gonna find us. We'll be out of here before the sun goes down. I know it." Hunk's eyes softened. "I know you believe that, but You can't help worrying. I know." Lance shrugged against the floor. "It's who you are. You worry and fret and imagine all the worst case scenarios there are. But when push comes to shove, you're strong as a mountain and brave as a bear." Hunk sighed. "Lance, don't worry about me." Lance pushed his face forward again and rested his head under Hunk's chin. He put his right arm around him too, hooking under Hunk's armpit. He kept his left wrist hidden on the floor between their bodies so the camera wouldn't see it when the indicator light didn't turn on. He patted Hunk's back and wished that Hunk could hug him. As if sensing this, Hunk tucked his chin over Lance's head and curled around him as much as he could. The instant Lance knew for sure that he'd succeeded in deactivating his left cuff, he was going to do his right cuff, then Hunk's and Keith's. He would have to be sneaky about it, and Hunk would still have to stay on the floor until they were ready to strike. But for now, all they could do was wait. He was tired, but he'd promised Hunk that he wouldn't go to sleep. Instead, he let his mind drift, and without meaning to, he found himself reaching for Blue again. It was habit now. After more than a year of partnership, Lance could feel Blue's presence no matter where he was in the castle, and he liked reaching out to her. At random intervals, whenever he felt like it, sometimes for no reason at all. Anytime, day or night, he basically waved his hand in Blue's metaphorical face and bombarded her with his current feelings and thoughts, like some kind of brain vomit. Blue always accepted him and never thought he was annoying or stupid, never told him to shut up or tone it down, never got tired of listening to him chatter. Instead, she seemed enthusiastic and happy every single time. Even Hunk got tired of Lance's never-ending bull occasionally, so Blue was pretty much the most amazing being in the entire universe just for that. He knew he was too far away right now. He always kind of quietly resented these missions that separated him from Blue, which was silly, so he would never tell anyone. But still, it didn't feel good to keep reaching out like this on habit and find nothing but the cold, empty buzz of too much distance. But he couldn't make himself stop. At least these missions didn't usually last too long. But this time it was different. Yeah, the distance was definitely too great, but he swore that he could almost touch Blue, even so. The usual cold buzz of emptiness seemed warmer than usual, more alive. He couldn't talk to her, not really, but he got the feeling that she was angry and upset and searching for him. Blue was searching for him. Lance blinked against Hunk's chest, his breathing stuttering in his throat. She was still too far away, but she was looking. She wanted to come. She wanted to save him. The bond had never been quite like this before. The Malcordons with that machine. Had they done something permanent to him? To his brain? Maybe the effects of the supercharge weren't just temporary. That would be awesome! Lance had a weird urge to thank them. Then he remembered what they had done to Hunk, what they were doing to Keith right now, and he changed his mind. He felt the tingle in his wrist that meant the cuff was about to activate. Only on the right wrist, though. Lance put down the yell of the triumph that wanted to burst out of his mouth and quickly pulled his hand back to his body so he wouldn't hurt Hunk when the cuff rocketed to the floor. That unpleasant buzz, a loud thunk, and there he was, stuck to the floor. Lance gasped at the shock of it against his bruised and aching muscles, even though he'd done his best to minimize the fall. But his left wrist... Lance stared down at it, almost hidden between his chest and Hunk's. He rocked his hand back and forth on the floor. His left wrist moved. The indicator light wasn't on. He had succeeded in deactivating the cuff. Then a horrified gasp jerked out of Hunk's mouth, and Lance twisted his head around to look at the door. They were bringing Keith in. At least Keith was conscious, barely, hanging between the two goons like a sack of meat, but... blood. There was a lot of blood. Too much blood. "What did you do to him?" Lance yelled, almost breathless with fury. His right wrist tugged on the cuff as he tried to roll over and sit up, and it hurt. It hurt! But he didn't care. The guards let go of Keith, and his knees collapsed beneath him, just like that, unable to hold up his weight. His eyes were wide and rolling with shock and pain, and he folded up in a ball and thumped it down sideways onto the floor. His head struck last, with a nasty crack that made Lance wince and Hunk flinch. Hunk's entire body was stiff and trembling with tension, and Lance was so angry that he could barely see. "Let me go!" he yelled at the corner of the room, at the ceiling, at wherever the camera was. "Let me go! Let me go! I've got to stop the bleeding!" They made him wait as the guards took their time leaving, and the door finally shut again, and the sound of the lock filled the room like the fall of a boulder, trapping them in a lightless, airless cave. Finally, Lance's cuff released, and he ducked out of Hunk's arms and scrambled to Keith. "Keith! Where's the blood coming from, do you know?" Lance grabbed Keith's shoulder and tried to pull him onto his back so he could have a look, but Keith groaned and curled up harder in an attempt to shield himself. He seemed out of it, but he was conscious enough to respond. Lance pulled back as if he had been burned and knelt there gaping at Keith for a moment. His heart was racing. He didn't know what to do. Blood was beginning to collect on the floor under Keith's body, not enough to call a puddle, but definitely more than a splash. "Keith!" Lance tried again, and this time Keith was too weak to resist him. He got him over on his back, hands shaking, and was finally able to view the utter mess that was the front of Keith's body. His shirt was absolutely shredded, dark strips of fabric mingling with the blood still leaking from his chest and abdomen. It was a gruesome sight. Behind him, Lance heard Hunk gagging. Lance hesitated, hands hovering in the air over Keith's body. Keith blinked up at him, dazed and pale. How much blood had he lost? How much could he afford to lose? He could go into shock from this. He could go into shock and die because their enemies had locked them in this chilly prison cell with no first aid kit, no bandages, no supplies, not even a blanket. "Lance, you gotta calm down." Hunk's voice. He sounded wavery and shaky himself, but he was trying, and that was what counted. "You can't panic. You're the only one who can help him. You have to step up. You can do it, babe. I know you can." Lance pulled in a deep, shuddery breath that jarred his chest and burned in his throat. Keith stared up at him, eyes glazed and distant, barely aware of his presence. Hunk was right. He had to do this. No one else could. All right. First step first. Lance surveyed the ravaged landscape of Keith's torso. He had to see the damage first, figure out where the blood was coming from so he could determine the best course of action. Keith, I'm gonna touch you, okay? It might hurt. Please stay as still as you can. Keith blinked, then nodded. He stared at Lance without blinking. It was a little unnerving, but Lance could take it. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment and pulled in another hard breath, then reached out. He tried to be gentle, picking the pieces of shredded shirt out of the cuts that crisscrossed Keith's chest and stomach as delicately as possible, but Keith still groaned and shuddered at his touch. He didn't move, though, not much, just a few little jerks of his shoulders as he fought to keep still. Gradually, but as quickly as he dared, Lance cleaned the ruined cloth out of Keith's many wounds, pushing it to the sides onto the floor. When he finished, he sat back on his heels for a moment and stared. Keith was covered in wounds from his neck to his waist. They had been made with some sort of blade, cuts and slashes, some short, some long. Most of them were pretty shallow, but they had all bled a lot. A couple of them looked deeper, and those were still leaking, bright red, sluggish, and alarming. In fact, most of the cuts needed attention of some sort, but Lance had to do triage. Okay, I can do this. Lance took off his own shirt, hands shaking in his haste. He left bloody fingerprints on everything he touched, but it didn't matter. The cloth was about to get a whole lot bloodier. He folded the shirt into a rectangular compress, then looked over Keith's body again, trying to figure out which cut was the worst. There were at least 3 particularly bad ones to choose from. He met Keith's eyes for a moment. I'm going to put pressure on your wounds, okay? I gotta stop the bleeding. It's probably gonna hurt, but I gotta. Keith's eyelids fluttered weakly, but he managed a nod. Lance nodded back, then looked back to his wounds. Okay, that one. Lance picked a long slash that went in a diagonal path from Keith's lower rib cage to his left hip bone. He put his folded pajama shirt against the flow of red and pressed down hard. Keith moaned and shuddered. His fingers twitched against the cold floor, but he made no other objection. Lance pressed as hard as he could, tears pricking the corners of his eyes. His arms shook, and he cursed his weakness, the fact that the Malcordans had seen fit to abuse every single muscle in his body before they did this to Keith. It made things so much harder. Hunk! Lance gasped. Talk! Tell us a story! Sing us a song! Something! Please! He couldn't stand to listen to Keith's little whimpers of pain, not for a second longer. Hunk made a choking sound, but he did it. He couldn't seem to gather his wits for a story, so he sang. He started singing a silly pop song that had been on the radio a lot right before they fell into that cavern and found Blue. Lance and Hunk liked to play a radio station on the computer in their room while they studied together, and this song had compelled them to get up and dance around the room on more than one occasion. Hunk's voice was shaky, but grew stronger as he continued. The chorus was particularly earwormy, and Lance sometimes loved it, sometimes hated it. Just the beat of my heart, just the beat of my heart, just the beat, beat, beat of my heart, 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 heart. Today, it was grating. Lance was kneeling here, watching Keith bleed out on the floor, and another surge of blood seemed to leave his body with every repetition in that stupid, stupid chorus. The cloth in Lance's hands was soaked through with red already, and while he held it there with all his strength, he had to watch the other cuts bleed without intervention. He needed more hands. No! He blurted, voice rasping and harsh. Hunk stopped singing, though Lance hadn't really been talking to him. He turned his head and looked up at the ceiling, the walls, the corners, glaring with all the fury he had in him. I can't do it alone, he said. Then he yelled, I can't do it alone! Do you want the Red Paladin to die? He will, unless you give me more. Give me something, bandages, supplies, whatever, or at least let Hunk go. Let the Yellow Paladin go. I need his hands. The Red Paladin will die if you don't let him go. And then, how will you ever learn how to pilot a lion of Voltron? For a long moment, there was silence. Lance glared at the walls. Keith's lips pressed together as he tried to stifle his noises of pain. Then Hunk gasped, and there was an almost inaudible change in the air. The low hum of his cuffs gone as they deactivated. Lance badly wanted to pump his fists in triumph, but he didn't dare move his hands. In seconds, Hunk was there, kneeling on Keith's other side. He looked him over with wide eyes, visibly gulping down nausea. Hunk had never been good with blood, or other bodily fluids. Lance felt bad asking this of him, but he didn't have a choice. Are your hands okay, buddy? He asked. Hunk looked down at his hands, squeezing his fingers into his palms in a rhythmic motion. A little numb, but the feeling is coming back. he hissed through his teeth, fingers spasming for a moment, and Lance's heart lurched into his throat. But Hunk shook his head, still bumping his hands. It's okay. Pins and needles. Lance grimaced in sympathy, but then he nodded down at Keith. The big gash on the right side of his chest, please. Hunk nodded briskly, all business now that Lance had given him a job. He stripped off his own shirt and tore it in half, choosing to do it along the waist for some reason, then folded the top half into a compress and pressed it against the bleeding cut. Keith whined a bit in protest, squirming under the sudden touch, but then he went still again and just blinked at the ceiling. Lance stared down at the compress under his hands. It wasn't completely soaked, and no more red seemed to be flowing into it, at least at the moment. Still, he couldn't release the pressure. He didn't dare lift his hands to see if the bleeding was slowing. In normal circumstances, when performing first aid for someone with a bleeding wound, you would sit there and keep pressure until emergency services arrived. They needed bandages. They needed antiseptic and gauze and elastic and aspirin and pain-relieving cream and everything else that would probably be in a standardized first aid kit back on Earth. Or an Altean cryo-replenisher. That would be nice. But they had none of that. Just two scared, desperate kids in borrowed pajamas kneeling on the floor of a cold prison cell while their friend bled in front of them. But Hunk was a total freaking hero. Of course, after his initial very quiet freak out, he buckled down to the job. His eyes got hard and analytical, looking Keith over like he was a problem to be solved, but his hands were always gentle and compassionate, and his voice was soft. Hunk had dexterous hands. After maintaining pressure on Keith's chest with both hands for several minutes, he shifted so only one hand held down the compress. With the other, he picked up the discarded half of his shirt. He wedged a corner under one foot and started tearing the cloth into strips. Suddenly, Lance understood why Hunk had torn the shirt horizontally instead of vertically. Longer strips. Okay, Hunk said, soothing and firm. Keith, we're gonna need to sit you up, okay? Then we'll wrap up your chest and stomach, keep these cuts under pressure. One big hand folded under Keith's shoulder, the other still holding the cut on his chest. The cut Lance was tending was too big for him to let go with one hand, otherwise he would be reaching for Keith's shoulder too. Keith, Hunk asked, can you hear me? Keith blinked at him, then nodded. I can sit up, he said, voice soft, a little wandering. I'll help you. Okay, let's do it. 1, 2, 3, go. Hunk pulled on his shoulder smoothly but strongly, and Keith's abdominal muscles strained under Lance's hands. Keith grunted in pain and effort, his entire body tensing. But Hunk lifted him almost effortlessly, even with one hand. Upright, Keith started to slump, and Hunk's hold on his shoulder shifted to prop him up. Okay, good job, buddy. Can you hold this cloth on your chest while I start wrapping you? Keith nodded loosely, and Lance wasn't at all sure that he trusted this. But Keith's hands rose and pressed, and Hunk slowly let go, after making sure he was strong enough. Keith's hands shook, and it took both his hands to do what Hunk had done with one. Already, Lance thought he saw a little more blood leak into the yellow compress. He cast a wide-eyed look to Hunk, saw by his expression that he'd already noticed. Okay, Hunk said. I'll have to be quick. And it was. He removed the remnants of Keith's shredded shirt from his back and shoulders, then started swaddling him in strips of yellow pajama. Keith breathed slowly, staring into the distance and holding himself as straight as he could. When Hunk got to the compress on his chest, he gently shifted Keith's hands for him until he could wrap it completely. Then Keith dropped his hands to his lap and just sat there. Lance watched him, nibbling on his bottom lip in worry. It really did seem like Keith was in some kind of shock. He wasn't shivering or anything, but how were they going to deal with this? They didn't even have a blanket to put around his shoulders. Well, as ever, Lance's best offering was words. Hey, Keith! You hearing me? Keith blinked and shifted his head to the side to look at him. Lance grimaced, but he couldn't really think of anything else to talk about. Do you remember what happened when they took you? Did they try to wipe your mind? Keith stared at him without blinking for a long moment. He seemed strangely fixated. Lance began to wonder if there was something on his face. Keith, buddy, are you with us? Keith frowned. Your nose is bleeding, Lance turned his head and rubbed his nose on his shoulder, then twisted his head to look at it. Yeah, there was a little smear of rib, but it was nothing, barely a smudge. He looked back to Keith's face. It's fine, don't worry about it. Keith's frown deepened. He was still staring at Lance, focused and intent, and Lance realized that he was staring directly at his nose. Make it stop. Lance made an exasperated noise. I can't help it, Keith. So it's bleeding again. Whatever, it's fine. We're a little more worried about you right now, okay? Keith glanced down at himself, at the bandages that Hunk was still pulling tight, one round at a time. He dismissed his own wounds with a small grunt and focused back on Lance's nose again. His eyes were glassy. You need to stop bleeding. My hands are busy right now! Despite himself, Lance was getting annoyed. Trust Keith to get obsessed with the stupidest little thing that didn't matter at all. And anyway, why don't you stop bleeding, you jerk? You first, Keith insisted. I can't! Shut up! Hunk sighed. Guys, please, you both need to stop bleeding. There was way too much blood on the floor. Lance snorted, which actually hurt a little bit through his sore nose. But under his annoyance was a big pile of worry. Keith wasn't processing well. He really must be in shock. He drew in a breath and tried to reorient himself, then looked into Keith's face. Hey, Keith, look at my eyes. It was clearly a struggle, but Keith did his best to comply. He watched Lance steadily, just a hint of comprehension back. Let's talk about something else, okay? Do you know if they used the mind wipe on you? Do you remember everything that happened? Keith's forehead wrinkled in thought. Lance could almost see him thinking, but your nose is bleeding and it should stop. He didn't say that though, just sat still for a moment as he deeply pondered Lance's question. I remember. I think I remember everything. So they didn't try to wipe your mind? Lance repeated patiently. Keith's gaze slid to his nose again. Lance cleared his throat, trying to bring him back, and Keith looked into his eyes. No, he said slowly. I don't think so. Lance nodded, urging him to go on. I think they were in a hurry. Kept saying running out of time. Probably didn't try to wipe because it takes too much time. They're gonna do us all at once at the end. I think. That makes sense, right? Lance nodded more vigorously, trying to encourage him. A splatter of blood at the floor. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Do you have any idea why they thought they were running out of time? Were they always planning on just keeping us for a short while? Or did their plans change? Could you tell from the way they were talking? Keith closed his eyes for a moment, body jerking as Hunk hit a bad spot. He sucked in a breath, and Hunk apologized in the background, one large hand covering Keith's back for a moment. It seemed unplanned. Keith winced, and he looked at Lance with more comprehension. They were in a hurry, the way they questioned me. Lance's face screwed up. He hadn't meant to ask about that part. He'd figured it could go without saying that the Malcordons had been interrogating Keith for information on how piloting the Lions worked. What else would they be asking him? They were in a hurry, Keith repeated slowly. They weren't careful. He lifted a hand, slow, shaking, and rested it over Lance's, still holding the cut across his stomach. If they were careful, I don't think they would have cut so deep. They were in a hurry. Lance cursed under his breath. So Keith's wounds were worse than they should have been because his torturers were under pressure to hurry up and get the job done. Maybe that was why they let Hunk go with very little persuasion. If they were still hoping to cover this up, return the three of them to Shiro and Pidge without revealing just who was behind this fiasco, it was in their interests to do as little damage as possible. While still getting what they wanted, of course. I'm sorry, man, Lance said with utter sincerity. This sucks. Keith gave him a faint smile, shuddering again as Hunk rapped lower. Understatement. Lance rolled his eyes, but it was true. Hunk had gotten to Lance's compress now, so he shifted his hands as Hunk continued to rap. Soon Keith was swaddled like a mummy from armpits to waist, bigger lumps under the bandages where Lance's shirt and the other half of Hunk's shirt were hidden. Hunk finished with a square knot, Boy Scout efficient, and a shiver passed over Keith's shoulders in response. In fact, he was starting to shiver all over. Hard. Lance had been holding him, supporting him while Hunk worked, but now he carefully passed Keith over to lean against Hunk. He went back to the place where they'd been sitting to fetch Keith's jacket and brought it back, and he and Hunk helped him put it on. Keith was still shivering, slumped against Hunk's side with his eyes drooping, so Lance snuggled up against his other side, wrapping his arms around both of his buddies as far as they would go. Hunk mirrored him on the other side, and now they were in a huddled lump of miserable, shivering flesh, two of them shirtless, one wrapped in bandages and a short jacket. "Ah!" Lance said. It was a pretty eloquent summation of the situation, he thought. Hunk snorted in agreement. They had to get out of here. They had to. Keith could die if he didn't get real medical attention. As soon as they got Keith warmed up, as soon as they were sure he wouldn't die of shock, Lance was going to maneuver them so he could disable all the cuffs without the cameras seeing. And then? Well, next time the Malcordans came to take one of them away, they were going to fight back.